Okay. All right, the live stream is up. While I'm letting folks in, I want you to take a look at, and I posted this in discussions, and I'm going to try to make sure that you all can see this. But take a look at this, study this for a few minutes. We are looking at levels of organization. Today, we're going to be looking at communities. So make sure you understand the levels of organization. And I'm still letting people in. Okay. Okay, let me look at what that might be. All right, so this is in your discussion area. I'm going to look at somebody's question. And let one more person in. All right, cool. All right, I appreciate you. So like again, after 5 minutes, I'm going to go ahead and start explaining. So I appreciate those of you who are on time. So again, hopefully you can, is there anybody who cannot locate this discussion? And this it's not a, it's just a file that I need you to look at. It's not, there's no question associated. I'm going to ask a question, but I want you to look at this as a review item. You can't find it. Okay, that's what I was looking at. So let me see why that is. I copied it. Well, we'll copy it again. Okay, let's see, because I didn't see it either. That's why I asked. Okay, it's supposed to be an ecological, and it's supposed to be three. And you might have to refresh your page. I know I might have to refresh mine because I certainly did not see it there. Okay, here it is. Okay, so it should be on your Canvas page. It'll say levels of organization. And again, this is just a picture that I want you to be able to study. All right, so when we're talking about living things, if you were in a biology class, you would start with molecules, and molecules organize themselves to make cells, and the cell is the basic unit of structure and function for all living things. So again, cells will organize themselves to make tissues and organ systems until we get to the point of being a whole organism. And this is where we start in environmental science. We start with the organism. And so an organism is an individual. And so we're looking at one species or one kind of organism. And a group of that one kind of organism would be a population. So we have several different populations, but they're all each one kind of organism. And then you put this organism in a group with other populations. Okay, so up to this point in our discussion, we're still just talking about the living things. Okay, so when we get to community populations that live together and in a defined area, so we're looking at just a one particular location. We're not talking about the whole planet. We were talking about a particular location and how many different kinds of populations live in that defined area. Okay, so in this picture, you have a hawk, whereas we started off with bison as our individual population. Now this bison is living in an area where there's also also snakes, there's hawks, there's prairie dogs, and there's grass. And all of those are living things. Okay. And then we'll get to the point where we're going to include the ecosystem. That's going to include our abiotic factors. And so notice in that picture, you got the same organisms, but now we're including the rocks, the air. There should be sunshine. That was also an abiotic factor. Anything that's not a living thing is included in the ecosystem because all those things are needed for the living things to survive. So they don't just survive on other living things, they survive with the non-living things too, the soil, type of soil, the climate, the air, the rocks, that kind of thing. And then all of that is part of our whole planet. So the whole planet is the biosphere. All right, so I ran through that as a review. We're specifically going to look at communities today, which if you haven't already done so, make sure that you're working on your symbiosis project. Let me come back here. So again, mine keeps scrolling in places I don't want it to go. All right, so we are here. So everybody should be, if you haven't already submitted it, you should be working on getting this submitted by Thursday the 12th, and make sure that you have, and again, you only want, there are 3 types of symbiotic relationships that we're looking at. I'm done with the project. Somebody said they could not, they couldn't download images. Find images that you can. Not all images are going to be blocked. Certain websites will block their images. Certain, they're not free. So find free images that you can use. But you definitely need to include images with your report. Okay, so pick a different website, pick a different picture of that organism, put in free images of, so that you know that they won't be blocked, because some will not let you. Some are going to be web pictures. You can't download web pictures. They won't save into your project. So find ones that will. I mean, it might be like, and I run into that. The picture that I really, really like is the one that will not download properly or that you can't use for free. But just change um, the picture to another one. All right, so again, we were talking about interactions of living things, and there were 5 different types of relationships. Sorry, I got too much lotion here. So we're just focusing on 3: commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. You only had to pick one. And in a relationship takes 2 individuals. So you want to describe 2 individuals that are in a relationship with each other in the environment. Describe, is it a commensalism relationship, mutualism, or parasitism relationship? Okay. And I'm explaining this. There were some people who were absent, so they need an explanation as to what this activity is about. All right. So once you pick one of those relationships, um, that is the title of your report. And then you are doing the research on the background. I'll go back to that in a minute. Let me finish this one. And you don't have to reply to that post. You're just looking at that picture. So there was no, and that discussion, yeah, there's no, you're not replying to that. You're just using that as a reference picture. All right. So again, for number 2, you want to talk about what kind of relation, what are they doing in this relationship? What activities are involved in the relationship that they have with each other? And explain it in terms, so you need to define which why you're saying it's a commensalism, mutualism, or parasitism. So say what they do, what they're doing for each other or against each other, and gather some data that explains what those relationships do for their environment. Okay. Then the human impact. Um, are we involved in this at all? How do they affect us? I mentioned earlier, and I'm gonna keep mentioning it, the circle of life. Anything that's going on in the environment affects other organisms in the environment. So while they are having a relationship with each other, how are how is their relationship affecting our environment or other members of their ecosystem? Okay. And again, you might have graphs. So we talked about certain relationships. If they're intense, it makes a graph, a nice little graph of how the population grows or increases and decreases depending on their relationship. You don't have to have a graph, but you do have to have pictures. Okay. And then you need to have a conclusion, and you definitely need to cite your references. And again, citing your references is not say I got it from Google. Google is a search engine. So what website that Google sends you to for you to look up your information. And that includes where you got your pictures from. So the pictures originate from a website. So that might be that you could go to the website where you see the picture on Google Images, and then go click on it, and then view this image, and it'll take you to the article or the website where that picture originated, and you might be able to better get a copy of the picture from there. Okay. Any questions about this? Okay. All righty. So that's due Thursday if you haven't already done it. Um, Moving on. So today, and it doesn't say published. I thought it did. Okay. Let me know if yours is published. It should be. Thought I did say third period today. Okay. Just checking. All right. So we are looking again at the term community. So that's why I had you look at the overall graph, because we're moving our way up the hierarchy of the ecosystem. So we're moving from an individual to a population to a group of organisms living in the same area. Okay. So um, your neighborhood is your community. Okay. And your community is in a bigger area of Columbus, but your small little community only takes in so many people, so many trees, so much grass. All of that is in that one location. Okay. All right. So this says, for instance, an Arctic community just has a few species, while a tropical community may have large number of species per cubic area. So again, geographic map of the world, depending on where that community is located, will dictate, like it said, the diversity. So we're going to look at this little clip here on diversity, um, and numbers and population numbers. Okay, so there's a difference between those two words. So let's look at this real quick.
You think about our biodiversity tutorials as an archipelago, then today we visit this island to discover why biodiversity is so important. In terms of biodiversity, we mean a lot of different things. In this case, we're going to talk about something that's known as species richness, because that's something that we can measure. Because counting up the number of species, going out, finding out how many species there are in a given environment, is something that we can actually do. There are different species of plants, there are many different species of animals, many different species of microbes, and many different species of fungi. and they all interact in their environment to create what we would call an ecosystem. Eco is an interesting word. It's an ancient word that means house. So it's a system of what goes on in your house, that is, where we all live. All of these different organisms are interacting. They're behaving together. They're interacting with one another. Some of them eat each other, others decompose into, and they, plus the physical environment or the house, form the ecosystem. Why would the number of species, in other words, species richness, be crucial to the way an ecosystem functions? What is it about the number of species that makes the ecosystem work better and contribute to the resiliency or the stability of the ecosystem? Scientists are really beginning to study this, and the emerging field is referred to as BEF, biodiversity ecosystem function. We can think of any ecosystem as species that network.
Okay, we're going, I guess the clip stops there because we'll finish talking about that later on. But a couple of vocabulary words I want you to understand was biodiversity. So if you haven't made a note of that, biodiversity, again, bio meaning life, and diversity means a variety of. So we're looking at how the different levels of variety that there are in a particular ecosystem, in a particular location. They looked at one, it started off by telling you that they're looking at one little island in this whole area. So they would just be looking at, and the other word that they brought up was species richness. I don't know why that's not coming out this morning. Species richness. Okay, how many of these organisms do we actually have? Okay. And another thing he mentioned is a lot of these studies, there's a lot of things that you want to study, but there's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. You can count. You can go out and count the number of organisms there are in a given location. Okay. All right. Species structure. Take note of that vocabulary word. Composition of a community, including the number of species, and their relative numbers, which includes the patterns of interactions. Okay. It's kind of like the report that you're working on. Who interacts with who? It can be different levels of life, um, but it's more specifically the fact that you have a variety, like again, we're looking at a particular location. So our biodiversity would describe, and again, it's going to be different in different locations. Like, for example, like if I picked your community, he used a house. But if you pick your community and then you look at your community as opposed to the one next door or one that lives near a golf course. Hold on, I need to admit somebody. Okay. The things that you have, the signs of life and non-living things in your community may be different to, like I said, the golf course, because in your community you've got a lot of pavement because you got streets in your community. You have different trees. You might even have a different type of grass because they have special grass on a golf course. You're not going to have the same number of trees maybe where they are, or even the number of trees because it's cleared because it's a golf course where you may have a lot of trees in your neighborhood. So the number of species in one community is different than the number of trees in the other community. The variety of trees or the diversity of trees in one place might be different than they have in another area. The number of animals you are included in your neighborhood, the cats, the dogs, the birds that are specialized in the trees that are in your neighborhood. The trees in the golf course area might not be the kind that the birds like. So there'll be a different kind of bird over there. There are no cats and dogs running around the golf course. So there's species diversity there is going to be different than in your community. Is that making sense to everybody? And I can see you can just nod your head up and down. Making sense? Yes. Okay. All righty. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and let you read the rest of this page, and I'll come back as soon as I finish taking attendance. I think we got everybody's in at the moment. So I'm going to do attendance while you read the rest of this page, and then I'll get back with you. Okay. But start with this one. This one has several things for you to read as far as defining species diversity and richness. So read that. You got to click through it, and then the two more vocabulary words that you need to look at. Okay. All right. So check that. All right. And I do have one comment. A lot of you, when you ask, can you go to the restroom? It's okay to turn your camera off, but don't log out. 'Cause, like right now, I'm doing attendance, so you don't want to be marked absent because you just went to the restroom. So make sure you stay logged in. When you come back, make sure I'm not looking at the ceiling. I got a couple of people who are not you're logged in. Logged in, I should see a body, not just the ceiling. So keep that in mind. All right, go ahead and read that page, and I've been answering questions, so I haven't done the attendance yet. Okay, that was easy to do. Looks like everybody's here today. Excuse me. Okay. Okay, so I'm sharing again. All right, notice it said, remember that all ecosystems include interactions between biotic and abiotic factors in a defined area. Wednesday, we're going to have a vocabulary quiz, so make sure you're keeping up with your vocabulary. So again, an ecosystem includes biotic and abiotic factors. When we were just talking about communities, we're only talking about biotic factors, the living things. All right, so the community structure, we have to keep in mind that they look at two important things. The composition of the community is measured on its richness and its species diversity. So they went on to define richness as the number of species in a particular community. So again, we were talking about your neighborhood and the golf course and having a certain number of species in one place as opposed to having it in another. Um, they also pointed out where you would have on the planet um, a richer number of species. For example, in the desert, you're not going to have the same number of species the species richness that you would have um, at the equator. The equator, it's nice and warm and it rains a lot and there's a lot of vegetation there. So there's going to be more species richness in a tropical area as opposed to a desert. Or even I think the other example it gave was a polar region where it's very cold. The polar region can be considered a desert also in that has a low number of species. Okay, well, it has a lot of ice, and there are some species that live there. The species richness is different because it is kind of a frozen desert. Okay, so temperatures, amount of rainfall, the type of seasonal change. Because of the rotation of the Earth, we don't have the whole Earth. Does we have 4 seasons? Everybody doesn't have 4 seasons. Okay. All right, so that's species richness. The other term that they were looking at was species diversity, the number and kind of species that you have. Um, and here again, depending on the location, will depend on the kind of organisms that can live there. So you have more diversity in an area where the climate is better. Fewer organisms will thrive in an area where the climate is not good. Okay. All right, so those are things to keep in mind, those two vocabulary words. All right, so now we have two new words here. Species foundation and keystone species. Okay, gotcha. All right, the foundation species plays a unique role in creating the definition of the community. And it is an act of modifying the environment so that it can support other organisms. In other words, a lot of times this species is what everything else thrives off of or grows around. So it determines what else is going to live there. Okay. All right. The keystone species is disproportionately large effect on the community structure relative to its biomass or abundance. Keystone species differ from foundation species in two ways. They are likely to belong to a higher trophic level. They can be predators, and they act in more diverse ways than the foundation species, which modifies their environment. Okay, so while they depend on it, they um, their behavior has a greater effect on the ecosystem than the foundation species does. The foundation species may be the species that identifies the um, ecosystem, while the keystone species will tell you what's going on, who's acting, who's in charge. Okay. All right. So let's take a look bit closer look at your foundation species here. So we have kelp, which is very large. It looks very large leaves. It's algae, it's brown algae, but it looks kind of like water plants. Okay. So it's not, when we think of algae, a lot of times we think of microscopic organisms, but it can be this large seaweed looking thing. It is the foundation species that forms the basis of a kelp forest off the coast of California. So again, we have identified the location by this foundation species. We have kelp there. It's called a kelp forest. And it creates environments that allows the survival of other organisms. All right, then we have our coral reef is another foundation species. Again, the reef is identified by the presence of coral, and that's something people need to understand. Coral are actually little organisms that live inside the calcified structure called the reef. Okay, I think somewhere there was a quiz question, are corals alive? The coral is alive, okay, and they create this calcified structure on the outside. So they are the exoskeleton of the living and dead coral, which make up the reef. And it protects other species because other species live inside there. They find their home there. There are microscopic food there as well. So it provides an environment for other species, but it is the foundation of that area. All right, beavers modify their environment by building dams so that the dam itself creates the foundation because everything around it now depends on where the dam is, which side of the dam the water is being pooled on. There's always one side that has more water than the other side. And thus, maybe one side has more fish than the other side. Excuse me, talking too fast. Um, so them creating the dam, even though it wasn't there before, now becomes the foundation of that community. Okay, now we're looking at keystone species. All right, so they differ from foundation species and they're likely to be a higher trophic level. Trophic level, I don't know if you remember from biology, where it's the feeding level. So you have everything starts with producers at the bottom. And the first level, trophic level, is producers. Then you have the herbivores, which feed off of the producers. And then you have your carnivores, which feed off of the herbivores that are feeding off of the producers. And then you have your omnivores, which eat both plants and animals. So you keep going. So your hierarchy as you go up includes more things to eat. So what it's saying here is higher trophic level means that they're going to be eating both plants and animals. All right. So you have your sea star, and a lot of people are not used to seeing a starfish that actually moves, but it does move. It's not always hard like a rock if you've seen them on the beach. They actually are soft-bodied exoskeleton until they dry up and die. All right. Um, so the sea stars, when they are removed from the uh, intertidal zone where they live, as a result, the population of mussels increased. Okay. So this is what I was saying that you might have in your study. If you have a certain organism in the air and they feed off of the mussel, and there's a balance depending if there's a lot of sea stars and they're all feeding on the mussels, eventually the mussel population will decrease. And then when the mussel population decreases, then the sea stars are going to not have anything to eat. So they're either going to relocate to someplace else or they die off. Once that happens, that gives the mussels a chance to recoup. And so their population may grow. And then maybe at that point, the sea stars will come back. They say, oh, the food is abundant here again. And they come back. So the relationship between the two will rise and fall depending on the number of species that you have. So more sea stars, there's going to be less mussels. More mussels, there'll be more sea stars. Okay. All right. So let's look at
different interactions. They can live on top of one another, like certain birds nesting in trees, or even more crucially, these things might eat one another. This is a diagram, a network diagram of in which the organisms are interacting one with the other. Lines between the species to indicate those interactions. And we can make the lines directional to show that material or matter and energy are moving from one species to another. When one organism takes a bite of another, it not only gets a mouthful of matter or food, but that food contains energy. So these arrows show the direction that energy is flowing from one species to another. The most important thing about these webs is that the strength of these interactions can vary. That is, the interdependence of the organisms in the web can vary. And here's something that might be counterintuitive. These interactions become less important the more species you have within a network. You can think of it as the interactions being spread among more players. But what happens when there are fewer players? Let's say we've got a really super simple set of interactions where this owl is eating that mouse, but can also eat this squirrel. This gives the owl options. If we remove one of these, take that guy right out of there, then we only have two species interacting. And it's really easy to disturb this system. This guy will just eat all of these guys and boom, it caused total ecological collapse. So the higher the biodiversity or species richness in a system or in a network, the stronger it is, the more stable it will be because of all the additional options open to the organisms in it.
okay. So again, um, what he showed. Okay, there's two things that I wanted to point out in this.
This owl is eating that.
Okay, I want to go. I don't really want him to talk. All right, when we talk,
Also,
we go all the way back to when he was drawing all these little lines and stuff. All right, when we talk, so he was talking about a food web and the arrows. So you need to understand what the arrows mean. It is the flow of energy within an ecosystem, and the arrows always point at the direction that the energy is moving. Okay, so you need to understand the arrows. You need to understand, for example, this picture is a food web. There's a difference between a food web and a food chain. A food chain is a simple line that goes from, and again, our producer. So in a food web, there's always the producer, the one who eats the producer, and the one that eats the one that eats the producer. Okay, so that's simple. But in reality, is not one system going on in an ecosystem. So there are several organisms that live in an ecosystem. So this is representing all the organisms that live there and who eats what within that ecosystem. And the arrows indicate what is eaten. Okay, so all these circles at the top, we call those the top of the food chain because, for example, this one left side, um, it only has one thing, and I'm going to say that that one thing is a decomposer because all living things die. Other than that, all the arrows go away from that circle. That means that that one thing has three different things that it can eat. Okay, so it has choices. Sorry. When I coughed, I moved my mic. I apologize. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so what I was saying is the circle up on the top, and are you seeing my mouse thingy going around? The circle at the top left, notice it has three arrows that go away from it and only one arrow that goes to it. I'm going to say that that one arrow that goes to it is decomposer, so that when it dies, it is consumed by a decomposer. Other than that, this one is the top of the food chain in that it has choices. There are three different things that it can feed on. And so the arrow going away from the circle indicates what it eats. Okay. So it's the movement of energy. And again, we eat because we need to get energy. All right. So I wanted to talk about those arrows. The fact that this is a food web. And like we said, all of these things are important interactions with each other. But then he got real simple. All right, so he said, take for example, Mr. Owl. He has choices. Okay, so if one population gets low, he can start feeding on the other one. But then that changes when he only has one choice. Okay, so if he only has one choice and he eats up all of the mice, then what happens when all of the mice are gone? It affects the number, the population of owls. Okay, so the behavior of one population directly affects the behavior or the existence of the other population. All right, so we need to keep that in mind as far as structure is concerned. All right, so let's answer this question. Species richness describes the number of species present. True or false? Mm-hmm. Is this true or false? Somebody, anybody? All right, it's true. Next question. Species diversity is a measure of both the species richness and evenness. All right, she says it's true. All righty, good job. Thank you so much. Next one, biodiversity is the variety of life and its processes in an ecosystem in general, diverse, and more. Okay, I got a true response on that. Thank you much. All righty. So again, those are the three words that you needed to have understood in this section. So they've just repeated those three down here. So again, keep those in mind. All right. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Aiden. All right, so now we're looking at the next section. And here's this lovely girl who you have to read because she doesn't talk out loud. Oh, she's talking today.
Ecological succession is the process of change in the species. The timescale can be decades. For example, after a while, millions of years after a mass extinction. It's a process. It is a process by which an ecological community undergoes more or less orderly, predictable changes following a disturbance. So how is it initiated? Succession may be initiated either by formation of new unoccupied habitat, such as from a lava flow or severe landslide, or by some form of disturbance of the community, such as a fire, severe wind, or logging. And so how does a community begin? The community begins with relatively few pioneer plants and animals and develops until it becomes a stable or economic. Ecological succession is the cause of changes in an ecosystem which can lead to changes in the species found in that ecosystem. The consequences of this change can sometimes be subtle and sometimes an overt alteration of the environment.
Okay. So for that, you get there's another diagram that's involved so that you see that it's going to start in an area will start simple. If you've ever seen areas where they do building, they're going to put the grass first and eventually over time, and then trees and things of that nature. This just usually refers to the plant life in an area. It's defined by the plant life. So you're going to have low shrubs and grass that grows into areas where there's shrubs. And this is, again, we're talking about it in a natural area. So this was this is going to happen over time in an area that's undisturbed. So your grass will allow, once you get a lot of grass, it'll allow more stability in the soil, and then little shrubs can taller plants can grow. And once those taller plants establish themselves, then another larger type of plant may grow. Eventually you get to the point where a forest will grow, and they usually call that a climax community, nothing bigger than that. Okay, so once you get to that stage, that is your climax community. All right, let's see what Mr. Hot Talks Too Fast has to say.
Remember back in the days right after the Permian Triassic extinction event with that giant flaming asteroid and those methane explosions killed almost all the organisms on the planet? No, of course you don't, because that happened 252 million years ago. Big yet. But that's kind of the point of this episode. That asteroid was a disturbance to the ecology of the planet. The flora and the fauna and soils were largely wiped out, leaving a blank canvas for the organisms that survived, and there weren't really all that many of them to fill in as they could. What happened after the Permian Triassic disturbance is a dramatic example of ecological succession. How the makeup of a community changes over time, starting from like the day after a disturbance. Just usually the disturbance is a little less disturbing. The study of how ecological communities change doesn't just look at huge long periods of time where the effects of some apocalypse. Succession can easily happen over a season in a park or in just a few days in a patch of land as small as your garden. And this might come as a surprise, but disturbances that shake up the status quo within a community actually serve to make that community better in the long run. Because much like life and the entire universe, succession is all about change. And change is how a universe full of nothing but hydrogen came to include a planet full of life. Disturbances happen in ecosystems all the time, every day. A wildfire, a flood, a windstorm. After these unpredictable events, ecologists kept seeing predictable, even orderly changes in the ecosystem. How life deals with these disturbances is an important key to understanding ecosystems. First, let's note that a tree falling in the forest and a comet falling in the forest, while both disturbances are different levels of disturbance. Likewise, there are a couple of different types of succession. The first type, the one that happens after the asteroid hits or the glacier plows over the landscape, or the forest fire / volcano burns the verdant ecosystem into pure desolation, that's called a primary succession when organisms populate an area for the first time. The jumping off point for primary succession is your basic lifeless post-apocalyptic wasteland. You're probably thinking that place is terrible. Who would ever want to live there? Well, actually, there is one tremendous advantage to desolate wastelands. No competition. A lot of organisms don't mind settling down in the more inhospitable nooks and crannies of the planet. These pioneer species are often prokaryotes or protists, followed by non-vascular plants, then maybe some extra super hardy vascular plants. There are tons of organisms that make their living colonizing dead places. It's their thing. Like before the Permian-Triassic extinction, there were these dense forests of gymnosperms, probably full of species a lot like the conifers and ginkgos and cycads we still have today. But after the asteroid hit, the big forests died and were replaced by lycophytes, simpler vascular plants like the now extinct scale trees and today's club mosses. While they might have had a hard time competing with the more complicated plants in the good times, the rest of the Paleozoic flora barely survived extinction. Of all the dozens of species of ginkgo that were around back then, only one still exists, completely genetically isolated. A living fossil. It's important to remember that when we talk about primary ecological succession, we're talking about plants pretty much exclusively, because plants rule the world, remember? Without plants, the animals in a community don't stand a chance, and primary successional species are often plants that have wind-borne seeds like lycophytes, or mosses and lichens that have spores that blow in and colonize the area. And the outcome of a primary successional landscape is to build or rebuild soils, which develop over time as the mosses, grasses, and tiny little plants grow, die, and decompose. Once the soils are ready, slightly bigger plants can move in, at which point we move on to secondary succession, and then it's game on. A whole redwood forest could develop out of that. The primary succession takes a long time, like hundreds, maybe thousands of years in some places. In fact, the recovery of these big gymnosperm forests after the Permian-Triassic extinction event took about 4 or 5 million years. Dirt may seem unglamorous to you, but it is alive and beautiful and complicated, and making good soil takes time. Now, secondary succession isn't just the next act after primary succession has made a place livable after some disaster. It's usually the first response after a smaller disturbance, like a flood or a little fire has knocked back the plants that have been root for a while. Even a disturbance as small as a tree crashing down in the woods can make a tiny patch of forest more like it was 50 years ago. Before that one tree got so huge and shady. In that tiny area, there will suddenly be a different microclimate than in the rest of the forest, which might have more sunlight, slightly higher temperatures, less protection from weather, etc. And just like every other ecosystem on Earth, this tiny patch of forest will be affected by temperature and precipitation the most, which will be different in different parts of the forest. So as a result of the fallen tree, the soils will become different, the mix of plants will become different, and different animals will want to do business there because that little niche suits their needs better than other little niches. So the question becomes, when does succession stop and things get back to normal? Never! Because change doesn't end. Change is the only constant, people. You know who said that? Heraclitus in 500 BC, so it's been true since at least then. Consider it a lesson in life. And as ideas in ecology go, it's actually a pretty new way of looking at things. See, back in the early 20th century, ecologists noticed a tendency of communities to morph over time. But they also saw succession in terms of a community changing until it ultimately ended in what they called a climax community, which would have a predictable assemblage of species that would remain stable until the next big disturbance. Well, maybe that's what seemed to be happening, but ecological succession is actually a lot more complicated than that. For starters, there's a little thing called stochasticity, or randomness, which prevents us from ever knowing exactly what a community is going to look like 100 years after a disturbance. Stochasticity is basically your element of unpredictable variability in anything. So you can predict with some accuracy what plants are going to take over a glacial moraine after the ice has receded, because the seeds of some colonizer species typically make it there first. But unpredictable things like weather conditions during early stages of succession can end up favoring another species. Point is, scientists' attempt to predict what a community ends up looking like in 100 years should always be thought of as probabilities, not certainties. Another difficulty with the whole model of a climax community has to do with the idea of an ecosystem eventually stabilizing. That word stable, whenever it's used in a sentence that also includes the word ecology, you could pretty much be sure it's being used wrong, because stability never happens. There are always disturbances happening all the time in every ecosystem. A small portion of the forest might burn, a windstorm might take out a bunch of trees, some yeehaw might rent himself a backhoe one weekend and clear himself a little patch of heaven on the mountain beside his house because he's got nothing better to do. Who knows? Stuff happens. So instead of ending in some fixed, stable climax community, we now know that an ecosystem is in later successional stages if it has high biodiversity. Lots and lots of biodiversity. And the only way biodiversity could be high is if there are tons of little niches for all those species to fit into. And the only way there could be that many niches is if instead of a single community, an ecosystem is actually made up of thousands of tiny communities, a mosaic of habitats where specific communities of different organisms lived. Such mosaics of niches are created by disturbances over time, with everything always changing here and there, but it's important that these disturbances be of the right kind and the right scale, because it turns out that the kind of disturbances that have the greatest effect on biodiversity are the most moderate disturbances. When ecologists figured this out, they decided to call it the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, because it hypothesizes that intermediate disturbances, not too big and not too little, are ideal. See, just a little disturbance, like a falling tree or something, isn't really enough to change the game. On the other hand, a really severe disturbance like getting covered with lava would take the community all the way back to asteroid wipeout level primary succession. But every nice mid-level disturbance creates its own habitat at its own stage of succession with its own unique niches. More niches means more biodiversity, and more biodiversity means more stability and healthier ecosystems. Even if two disturbances happen in two different areas with roughly the same climate at the same time, the stochastic nature of ecosystems mean that the two areas might recover in completely different ways, leading to even more niches and more biodiversity. Now, this does not mean that you should go rent a backhoe tomorrow and cut a swath into the wilderness. It's just suggesting that a medium level of disturbance is natural and normal and good for an ecosystem. Keeps everybody on their toes. And like I said, disturbance happens, and by and large, we should let it happen. This, too, is a relatively new idea in ecology. In fact, for most of the history of public land management in the US, great swaths of forest were not allowed to burn, People consider the purpose of forests to be wood production, and you don't want to burn down some trees that are going to make you a bunch of money. But because of the lack of intermediate disturbances over a long period of time, we ended up with catastrophic fires like the one that torched Yellowstone National Park back in 1988. A single lightning strike totally annihilated almost 800,000 acres of public forest because the ecosystem hadn't been allowed to indulge in a nice leisurely burn every now and then. But now those forests have undergone more than 20 years of succession, and some parts have even reburned at a more intermediate level, creating a nice high biodiversity mosaic of habitats. And it's gorgeous. You should come visit us sometime. And that is ecological succession for you, how destruction and disturbance lead to beauty and diversity. Just remember what my main man Heraclitus said, and you'll be good. The only constant is change. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course Ecology, and thank you to everyone who helped us put this episode together. If you want to review any of the concepts that we studied today, there's a table of contents over there. And if you have any questions or ideas or comments, we're on Facebook and Twitter, and of course, down in the comments below. We'll see you next time.
Okay, he said a whole lot, but this summary over here in the corner, don't worry about the last number 4. Write down 1, 2, 3, primary succession, secondary succession, and climax community. We're going to look at those. I'm going to have a diagram for you for next class, but I did put a question in the chat that I want you to spend the last few minutes of class looking up. I don't know if you all followed the news, but last year, one of the Hawaiian Islands, Maui, had a tremendous fire that devastated the island. And so you had an area that was already a climax community, and then we had a natural disaster that wiped out everything. So I want you to look up what the community was like before the fire and what does it look like now. So write that question down and use the last few minutes to begin looking that up. I'm going to create it as a discussion question. So by the time you see next class, you'll see it as a discussion question in the module. But the question is, how did the fires of Maui alter the ecosystem? So that means you need to discuss what kind of ecosystem they had before the fire, what happened to it. Obviously, the fire wiped everything out. It wasn't just fire, too. It was other things other than fire. And what is happening today? What does the area look like today as they have started to recover? So that's what your question is going to be based on. Okay. So we're going to talk about succession. I'm going to give you there's a diagram that goes with this. He did a lot of talking, but he didn't give you the diagram that goes with this. So next class, I'm going to give you a diagram that outlines each step, what is happening at each step. But for the time being, I want you to work on this discussion question. Okay? So at least write the question down. We only got a few more minutes, but you can get started pulling up where to look. Start with the fires of Maui might be. Yes, you need to answer that question. Okay. All right, so Andre has said it had a profound impact on the ecosystem, leading to significant changes in flora and fauna. 2 lovely vocabulary words that you also need to be aware of, flora and fauna. So, yes, and habitats. So I need you to elaborate on that. So that's a wonderful start. Okay, and so if you write down what Andre said in the chat, that's a wonderful start right there. Okay. It says the region immediately after the fire resulted in destruction of vast vegetation and disturbed habitats. Okay. Yes, I got you. Habitats is that last word. Okay, so you do nothing else, start with that statement. That's a good place to start in answering that question. But what I'm also asking you to do is to be more specific. What were the changes? What was the flora and fauna before? And what is there now? And what has to eventually, um, what can come back and what probably won't come back? Okay. And here again, this is where environmental science is one of those subjects that you could look at what's happening in your life, in your lifetime. There are plenty of examples. We don't have to look at, you know, the ice age like he was discussing. Oh, speaking of which, and when he started off, he was talking about the theory of what killed off the dinosaurs, that there was a cataclysmic event in history that altered everything. And so we're looking at everything had to eventually grow back in stages. Okay. Okay. And I see a lot of you are putting information in the chat, and that's wonderful. That's wonderful. All right. So if you don't know where to start, a couple of people have put things in the chat that can give you a start. So again, I am going to put a discussion question, put this as a discussion question um, in the module. So you'll have to answer it there as well. So you just get an idea of how you want to get started. Okay. If there's any questions about what the question is asking you, now's the time to ask. But like I said, your classmates have given you a good start. Start there. And again, we're talking about ecological succession. So okay, the question is, and I'll put the question in again. Somebody asked me, say, what? Okay, so I'm going to put the question back in here again. All right. And how did the fires in Maui last year alter the ecosystem? So we want to talk about what the ecosystem was like before the fires, and then what is it looking like now? Because that was last year. So it's had time to recover. So do a little research as to what is it like now? What is the environment like now? So a couple of people have posted in the chat what happened and how that affected the flora and fauna of the area. So you want to make sure that you include that in your discussion. So thank you, Andre, for using those terms. So everybody needs to do that. I'm gonna. It's not up yet, but it'll be up by the end of the day. I'll have a place for you to post it. Okay. It's not called anything like right now. It's going to be called Maui Maui Ecosystem when I put it up. Okay. So look forward this afternoon or look forward tomorrow. It's not up yet. All right. Well, time's up. If you have no questions for me and you've written the question down, you are free to go.